Can I just get a show of hands as well? How many people are using TeamCity or you've heard of TeamCity? Okay. Yeah, so this talk is going to be about automating the deployment of .NET applications, so databases, Windows services, and ASP.NET web applications, using both TeamCity and our product Octopus Deploy. So we'll start off talking about why we should automate deployments, because it's, although to us as developers it can look like a pretty obvious thing that we should be doing, it can take a little bit to sell that up to a manager, and it's also, there's some interesting things to talk about just with regards to why we should be doing this. We'll then talk about how TeamCity and Octopus Deploy, what they do and how they can work together. We'll look at how to package apps for deployment, how to deploy them, and then how to make all that happen from within TeamCity. So before building Octopus, I worked as a consultant for Redify for 5 or 6 years, and I worked as a contractor in London for a while as well. And I went to a lot of different organizations, and each organization you go to, they have a different level of maturity in the way they develop software, in the way that they deliver that software to production. You go to some companies and there's a guy that's got a desktop, and he has copies and copies of folders and files, and he has no way of rolling back or anything like that. And so the first step for him or her to improve the ability to deliver software reliably is to get some kind of source control system in, so that at least they can see what they've changed and other people can get those changes. Bit hard to see, but the next stage is automated builds. So, if you've just got source control and you're checking out the code and compiling it on your machine, and then you're trying to deploy that to production, there's going to be libraries, all kinds of things that are on your machine that aren't necessarily going to be on the production machines. So an automated build system that's taking the code, compiling it, and getting it ready to be deployed is the next logical step. Those first couple of layers, getting source control in and getting automated build set up, it used to be a very complicated process to choose a source control system or to set up a build server. I remember back when Draco and Cruise Control were the primary build servers on .NET. But nowadays, setting up a product like TeamCity, it can take a few hours and you've got a pretty simple build process set up. But before I started Octopus, I worked on a project where we came in, we had a very short budget, a very short amount of time, and we hit the ground running, and we needed to get something into production really quickly. And day one, source control is set up, builds are set up. And then for like 4 weeks, we had someone working full-time with PowerShell, remoting, remote desktop connections, trying to make TFS do deployments, and it was just a really complicated problem. So Octopus exists to just try and make doing this a lot easier. And then, of course, when you're automating deployments into production, then you can start to look at other things like automatically monitoring applications, rolling back, that kind of thing. But these are the rungs involved in delivering software reliably. So why wouldn't I just deploy stuff manually? When I'm just deploying a web app that I'm using remote desktop to copy onto a machine, it can be a pretty quick way of getting something out there. But when I start to manage lots of machines, or I start to have to do this continuously, it creates a lot of problems. Humans make mistakes. You think you're on the UAT server remote desktop connection, but actually you're in production. Or you had a migration script that said, delete everything from this table where, some criteria, but you forgot to select the where part when you ran it. So humans make mistakes. It can just take a lot of time, especially when you're dealing with lots of machines, lots of changes to be made. And generally, because it requires someone accessing machines, the number of people who can do that in your organization are pretty limited. If you're deploying manually, there's probably only 1 or 2 people who have enough permissions to do that. If they win the cross lotto and they decide not to come back to work the next day, are you going to be able to do production deployments? It might take you a week just to get access to all the servers to be able to do that successfully. There's probably a lot of knowledge up in their head. It's also very opaque. So, we could go to TeamCity and we could see that our builds have completed successfully. We can see how many tests are run. You don't have to ask anybody. But then when we deployed stuff, you have to go over to somebody and say, hey, did you deploy that yesterday? What's happening? Can I see the logs? Well, the logs are scattered on 7 different servers because we don't centralize them. So finding a system that can automate that can really help to do that. And above all, production deployments are scary. Like if someone came to you and said, let's deploy to production tomorrow, and it was a manual system, what would your first reaction be? It'd be one of horror, right? Because you know deployment is painful, or it can be painful, unless you're using Octopus Deploy. So the thing on the right, I've seen that at investment banks, at government organizations. It's a lot more common, especially for companies that you would think have the budgets to do things properly and not just have people monkeying around on remote desktop, but that's the reality of most deployments. So we've been in business for about 2 years. We started building Octopus. Version 1's been out for about 12 months now, and we're working on version 2. But we started to do a survey with our customers, and we spoke to about 75 different people who had recently adopted Octopus because they were easy for us to contact, just to ask about their experiences with automation and how it's changed things. So we asked them firstly, how long did your deployments take before and after you automated them? And you'd kind of expect, well, you automate things, they get faster. Yeah, that's obvious. So you can see the grey, people doing things manually, and the green are after they automated them. And you can see there's a big shift to the left. Deployments take a lot less time. So that was kind of expected. But the interesting thing that came out of the survey and the people that we spoke to is that after they'd automated their deployments, they started doing them a lot more frequently. Because it makes sense, right? If something takes 8 hours or 4 hours, you're not going to do it every day, are you? And so deployments would typically be once or twice a month. As consultants, we used to go into organizations and they'd have these waterfall processes, and we'd get in and say, we're going to do things in an agile way, we're going to use Scrum, we're going to deliver value every week. And at the end of every week, you weren't really delivering value because you'd still have to wait 2 months before you could actually put that into production for someone to start using. So when people took on automation, something apart from just the speed of deployments changed that allowed them to deploy a lot more frequently. And we asked some qualitative questions as well. And I guess the biggest part of the feedback that we got from that was because they had automated things, there was a lot less risk, at least perceived by the team, of if we deploy tomorrow, there's less chance that things will go wrong, there's more chance that it'll be reliable. And when people feel like that, they're going to do it a lot more often. You're going to start deploying once a week, once a day. As soon as you've got a feature that's really important that someone's asked for, you can put that into production, and it's not a scary thing. It's not, oh, we're deploying at the end of the month. Hide. So we'll talk about TeamCity and Octopus now. So Octopus is a deployment server, and it's designed to fit into your existing processes. So we have a developer, they check stuff into source control. We don't have any opinions about, well, we have opinions, but we don't, the tool doesn't, have any dependency on you using a specific tool. So if you're unfortunate enough to use Team Foundation Server, that's fine. If you use Git, that's great. Your build server, if you're using TeamCity or Bamboo or Cruise Control or, again, Team Build, will take your code, it'll compile it. It does all the things a build server does, compile code, run tests, all those tasks. At the end of that process, you produce a package that contains the binaries and all the other files that you want to deploy. And Octopus's job then is to take those binaries and to get them into the machines and the cloud services and anywhere else where you want to deploy them. So we have, I guess, the opinion that you should only build your packages or build your binaries once. The same binaries that you promote to test or staging should be the same ones that go to production. And Octopus is designed to make that easy. We have an agent service. So we have a central server, the Octopus Deploy server, and we have an agent service that you install on all of your web servers, application servers, anywhere you're deploying. And it kind of takes on the role of being, imagine using SSH to automate a bunch of Linux machines, or using web deploy, all of those technologies, PowerShell remoting. We kind of try to make the tentacle be that one go-to point for deploying applications. And it's secure and has a lot of other things I can talk about later. So central to Octopus is the idea of a package. And for packaging, we use the NuGet package format, which everybody's familiar with. So NuGet packages are basically zip files with manifests. And so instead of asking you to just zip up your binaries and deploy them, we ask you to put them in a NuGet package because at least it has metadata about what's in the package. So it can have release notes and descriptions. And importantly, it has a version number. And packages live in a package repository. So it's very easy at any point to go to the repository and say, find me version 1.3 of this application, and there it is, ready to be deployed. So all automated deployment systems have this sort of concept of packaging. We use the NuGet package format. Okay, so switch over to a demo. So over here I've got a sample project that is building in TeamCity. You can see it's been compiling fine and running some unit tests. The source code for that lives over here. So it's got a database, it's got a Windows service, and it's got an ASP.NET website. To build that, I can go to the command line. And you're familiar with MS Build, so we just MS Build /T rebuild, configuration release, because it's a release build. And then you just add one more parameter, which is run octopack equals true. And the way you set up Octopack, so the job of Octopack is to create these NuGet packages from your app, is you'll go in here, and I just realized I don't have an internet connection. Oh. And so we install something called Octopack. And Octopack just plugs into, it makes some changes to your project files so that at the end of the build process, it will just generate these NuGet packages. So it thinks I've got it installed already. I don't. Okay, so Octopack goes into the projects that we plan to build and deploy. So I'm going to choose my database project, and I'll explain more about what's in there in a minute. My Windows service and my ASP.NET website, which is down here. So Octopack makes some changes to the build process. We'll save that. And when I run this command, it'll go and compile the code, and at the end of it, it'll produce in the binaries folder, it'll create some NuGet packages. So you probably saw from the command, it was emitting that. If I go to here and go to the website, for example, and there'll be an OctoFX trading website package, would have been this one. And so the contents of that for my website, because I'm deploying a website, it just has binaries that I need to deploy, and any of the views. It obviously doesn't have any of the C# source code from the package or anything like that. So to get that working in TeamCity, I'll just commit these changes with Octopack. I'm using a local Git server here, so it should be pretty quick. TeamCity will run the build. During this demo, there'll be a few places where we're waiting for things to build or deployments to run. If anyone's got any questions, now's a good time.
So you're saying you're committing that, you're committing to like a repository?
Yeah, I've got a Git repository locally that I've committed those changes to. And TeamCity, I'll just take you through the configuration of it. TeamCity is configured to take the code, run MS Build over it, just like I did from the command line, run the end unit tests, and it's also set up to trigger when I check in the code to that Git repository. So you can see it's built. That went up to 1.13 just a few moments ago. So TeamCity is building the code, the tests are running. To create the Octopack packages, we go into the build steps. And if you install the Octopack plugin or the Octopus Deploy plugin for TeamCity, which is just a zip file that you extract to your TeamCity folder. We add a couple of options here. So turn on Run Octopack, and you give it a version number of the package that you want to produce. So what I've done in TeamCity is I've set up a build number format, so 1.1 point some number, or this auto-incrementing number that TeamCity has. And then my build step is going to pass in that build number as the arguments to Octopack. So anyway, the end result of all of that is, if I go to the artifacts here, I've now got a bunch of NuGet packages that contain my website, my Windows service, and my database project.
Does that mean you've run the packaging twice? You ran it client-side when you first built it, and you built a NuGet package, but you also built the NuGet package on the server?
Yeah, you can run it locally if you want to do some testing, but generally, the idea is someone checks into source control, the build server builds the package. Yeah, you can build it locally. I showed you the command line version just because if you're not using TeamCity, it's still pretty easy to have Team Build or Bamboo or Cruise Control invoke that command line with those extra command line parameters. Okay. So we've got TeamCity producing a package. The next question is, how do we deploy this? So TeamCity's done some building, some packaging, and a package is now in this NuGet repository because TeamCity can host NuGet packages, and it provides an endpoint that you can query to say, find me version 1.3 of this package. So our job now is to figure out how to deploy that package with Octopus. So Octopus, like TeamCity, is a service that you install. You get a web-based front end. You might have seen the Octopus One UI. We've done some changes for 2.0, so things will look a bit different. Over here, I'm managing a very big farm of servers. So if I go to environments, Octopus has the concept of environments like staging, UAT, production, and it has machines that you register that you're going to deploy to. And each of the machines are in different roles. So my test environment is just one server that has two different roles. It's an app role and a web role. You can create, you define these roles, so you map them to your application and how it's going to be deployed. I've got an acceptance environment that has an app server and a web server. And I've got production, which has two web servers and an application server. So these agents, we have a nice installer that you run through. The machine gets registered. It's a fairly quick setup. And that's your environments tab. And then we have the concept of projects. So actually, before I do that, let's link Octopus to TeamCity. So Octopus has multiple package repositories that it can talk to. TeamCity is going to be one of them. So far I have Octopus just pointing to a local file share, which is certainly one option to have your build server put packages on a file share. To link it to TeamCity, we just go to the administration tab, NuGet settings, and we take this URL. And we have some credentials. And we can see if that works by searching it, and we get some packages coming back. So that's that power of having a package repository that can store your packages, because now any app can query it and find the versions of your packages that will be deployed. So now we create a project in Octopus. So a project is a set of packages that are going to be deployed all at one time. So I'll call this one OctoFX, which is my sample project. And on the process tab, you define all of the different steps that will be involved in deploying the project. So we can do lots of different things during a deployment. The most common one is just to deploy a NuGet package. That's what Octopus is really built for. But we can do other things as well, like just run an ad hoc PowerShell script. So if you've got a load balancer that you need to configure before you do a deployment, you can put that in a PowerShell script and have that run during deployment. We can send emails. We can even pause a deployment. So, a build server, when it compiles stuff, it just kind of runs from start to end and finishes. Deployments don't always work like that. So we can deploy a package, pause, wait for someone to come and verify that something works, or perhaps run some migration scripts or something, and then continue the deployment. So for now, I'll just say deploy a NuGet package. So what we're going to do to start off with is to deploy the SQL database that's in here. So the way I've done this is I've created a C# console application, and I've installed an open source project called DBUp. Octopus, we thought about putting some features in that are specifically about SQL migration, but we actually think this is a nicer solution to the problem. So we have a number of change scripts that we put in here. So every time you're adding a column, adding a table, that kind of thing, you script it out with SQL. There are obviously other migration tools you could use, and they'll all work with Octopus, but I at least like using T-SQL because it's a pretty good DSL for doing things with SQL Server. So we have some scripts, and then we have, I mentioned a command line application, which all it does is connects to the database and deploys those changes. And the nice thing about doing it this way, if I build this, imagine that a new developer comes to the team and they need a new copy of the database. So over here I've got SQL Express running. I'll just create a database called OctoFX Development. When they compile this, they can go and say, run this tool. So I've called my project OctoFX database.exe. They run it, it goes to SQL, it checks other tables there, which change scripts have been run so far, and anything that's new gets run. So if we expand this now, we get some tables that have been created. It also adds a table called schema versions, which just lists which scripts have already been run, and that way the next time you deploy, it'll just run the changes that haven't been run yet. So this is one way to handle SQL Server migrations. You could generate these scripts from Redgate SQL Compare, or there are other tools. You could use Entity Framework migrations. But however you do it, if you can bundle it into a NuGet package, and then you can have some way of invoking your executable or whatever's involved, that's how you would do a database migration. So my hook that Octopus gives me is I'm going to create a PowerShell script called deploy.ps1. And all it's going to do is run that application. So just like I did from the command line. And when I do this, I'll mark it as copy to my output directory, because Octopack, when it runs, the way it chooses which files to include in the package are based on the output directory. So we'll make sure that saves. Okay. So that'll go to TeamCity, and TeamCity will build it, and we'll have a package shortly. So now that my project is ready to be deployed, I'll go in here. I can skip giving it a name because it'll create one. I've got to choose where I want this package to be deployed to, and that's where roles come in. So the nice thing about deploying to a role is you can go and create more machines in an environment, add them to that role, and you don't have to change your deployment process. So we'll call that app. We'll call this OctoFX database. So that's the NuGet package I want to pick up. I'm not specifying the version of my package yet. That'll come later. The idea is you're creating a process that can be run repeatably for many deployments. Which is the environments that we can run in. So sometimes you'll have a package that's only deployed to test or only for production. In this case, I'm going to run it for all of them, and I'll hit save. Now, when you're deploying, there's always the aspect of configuration to worry about. So in my app config file, I've got this setting, a connection string, OctoFX database, which has a value here, which I'll copy. And when you're deploying, you're obviously going to have different connection strings for different environments. So the way we model that in Octopus is to have this concept of variables, and I'll call this OctoFX database. I'll paste that value in. So these can be multi-line now, which they couldn't in Octopus previously. It only took 6 months of work. But now I have a problem because I'm going to have different database servers for different environments. So the way we do this is I'm going to reference a variable which I'm about to create called server name as the value for my server in my connection string. And we're going to define that value in a second. I've also got the database is going to be OctoFX dash, and then I'm going to put the name of my environment. And Octopus has some inbuilt variables like octopus.environment.name. So that way when I deploy to production, it's going to be called production. If I deploy to staging, it'll be called staging. So I'll apply that change. So we've got this server name variable now. I can go here. I'll select those, and it'll be TDB01 for test, for example. This one will be application, and this one will be production. So 3 different variables for this value. And then for all of the variables, we have the concept of scoping. So for my first one, which was test, I can choose which environments that applies to. And it used to be in Octopus, you could kind of only choose one for each one. Here I can say this one applies to both. So that's a change we made recently. So that one's for test. This one's for acceptance. And this one's for production. Okay, so they all match up. I'll save that change. And before I deploy this, I've got to tell Octopus to go and change that configuration file, which is pretty easy. I'll just go down to here. And we have this notion of features. So we're .NET developers. We've built Octopus to be easy to deploy .NET applications. Everyone uses configuration files. So we can turn this feature on, and Octopus will open any config files that are in your package and figure out which variables it needs to apply, and it'll just go in and make those changes. So we hit apply. We're not writing any XPath queries or any XML transforms yet. It's just turn on a checkbox. Okay, so we've got our database project. Once we define our process, we create a release. And a release is a collection of different packages with different versions that you give a nice number to and add some release notes to that your team can see. And so far we've got a release, but we haven't deployed it anywhere. So a release in Octopus gets deployed to many different environments. Here we'll click on deploy, and we choose where we're deploying it. So if I go to deploy to test, we can see I've got my app server here. If I go to acceptance, it's going to show me it's going to deploy to a different machine. I'll start with test, and we'll run it. I'll go over some of these other options later. So Octopus isn't just a UI, it obviously has a server-side aspect to it. So at this point, we're going to run through this deployment process. We'll go to NuGet, we'll download these packages, and we'll extract them and run them on the remote machine. So we can drill in to view these logs. So we've downloaded the package from NuGet. We've updated the config file we end up running this XPath query instead. You can see it's now got the server name TDB01. It has the test environment in the name there. And then it's run that deployment script. Okay, and the nice thing about that is obviously those things will all run on that application server, but all the logs get brought back to one place, so you've just got a single deployment log to look at for everything that happened. Okay.
This is much nicer than a TFS deployer.
Thanks. So that deployment was successful. So when I'm looking at the release now, I can go back here and I can look at my release and I can see this release was deployed to test. I can see when it was deployed. I can see who created the release. If I go to the deployment, I can see who deployed it. So that's the kind of basic auditing information you won't get just if deployment is someone on remote desktop. We can then take that deployment and we can promote it to the next environment. So I'll choose acceptance, and again we'll run it, and it'll run through and deploy that. And here we can see we're now deploying to test. If I'm quick enough, we go to the dashboard, and it's finished that deployment. And now everyone has a single place where they can go and see which version of the app is deployed to which environment. All right. For production deployments, we might be a little bit scared of letting people just deploy a bunch of SQL scripts to production. So we can add a manual step to say, are you sure? Give it a name. And we can have this step only run in production deployments. And we can move this step up so that it runs first. And that's a very simple way to have a kind of an approval process. And you can choose, when you define this, which people can come and approve it. So maybe the people deploying the software and the people approving the deployment are going to be from different groups. So that's how you can do that. Okay, so the next step, we've got our database deployment process. I'll take this out. Is to deploy our Windows service. So the Windows service is just a standard Windows service C# application. The code is connecting to a SQL database from Hibernate, running a timer, doing something every few seconds. When this gets compiled over here in TeamCity, again, the package is just going to be, in fact, we can just view it from here. The package just contains all of the binaries needed to run the service. So setting up a deployment process for it's again the same. We're going to say deploy. We'll choose where it's going to run. So this is my Windows server, so it's going to run on my application server. And again, you define these roles yourself. You can have as many as you want. I'm deploying from my NuGet feed, which is pointing to TeamCity, and I want my Windows service project. Now, for Windows services in Octopus 1, we kind of just said write some PowerShell script to install the service. We tried to make that a bit easier for 2.0, so we could just turn on the Windows service feature. And again, we want the configuration variables feature because this has an app config, which is connecting to that database, so we'll have the same change applied. We give our service a name. I'll call it OctoFX dash, we'll say the name of the environment. So OctoFX environment name, leave the display name empty, the description, we'll say my service. We need the path, so in the package, we've got our OctoFX rate service executable here, so we're just going to point that. We can pass arguments to the service, which if you're using install util, is pretty hard to configure normally. We use sc.exe to set it up, so it's a bit easier. You can choose who the service runs as, including running it as a custom user. And by the way, when you choose the custom user option, down here you're typing in a password. That value is stored encrypted in the Octopus database, and once someone's written it, they can never read it again, so we don't present it back to you. So obviously we're not a password management system, but we store these things securely. If you do something silly like you have a PowerShell script and you write the value of that variable out, or it appears in a log, we'll do our best to try and strip it out of any log files that it would appear in. Okay, so we'll just run this as local system. And you can also specify dependencies and how the service is going to start. So I'll save that. And lastly, I'll deploy my web application as well. So this is just a standard ASP.NET MVC application. So I'll do add step, deploy my package. So I'm deploying my database package. I'll choose to update the config files. And we'll update an IS website and its application pool. And I better tell it to only run this on web servers. We do. So here I'll tell it, we're going to create a website in IS called OctoFX dash, and for this one we'll just use the name of the machine. So I'll bind this to a variable. So I'll create a bunch of websites in IIS on each, or one website on each machine that we're deploying to. If that site doesn't exist, Octopus will now create it. If it does already exist, then we'll just update it with any settings that you specified here. We can also create an application pool, so we'll just do the same thing actually for that. Choose which version of the .NET framework you're using, choose which identity that application pool will run under, and choose the bindings that IIS will listen on for that port. So you can specify hostname, headings, that kind of thing. I'll take out the default binding, and I'll add this one, and this is also going to be bound to a variable. So, okay. And lastly, the authentication option. This is a brilliant app that we're deploying, so anyone can access it. We'll save it, and that's our new deployment process. So now we can go to releases, and we'll create a new release. This, because I've changed the deployment process, I've now got 3 packages that are going to be deployed. If I go back to look at my old release, though, it still only has that that one package. So when you create a release, we snapshot all the configuration that's involved, the instructions on how to deploy it, and that way you get some consistency when you deploy it to the next environment, even if you've made changes. So we'll create a new release. I'll call this one 1.5 because we're deploying the same code the second time, and we'll hit save. Okay, and let's deploy this to the test environment. So this release is now multiple parts of the application being deployed. You can see we're deploying the database to the application server, then we'll deploy the rate service, then we'll deploy the website. We run through each step sequentially, so we wait for one to finish, then we start the next one. But within a step, if you're deploying to many machines, like a farm of 10 web servers, we run them all in parallel, so you're not sort of waiting for one after the other. But when I'm deploying to production, I might not necessarily want that. So we can go back, if we look at the output of one of these. You can see we've gone in, we've made some changes to the application pool, and if I go over here, so this site was running IIS, if I refresh it, hopefully my app will come up. Well, oh, there we go. Okay, so I've got an app running here that we've just deployed. Is that cool? Yep.
The service you installed, you said you're using SC. What if you're using something like TopShelf?
Yep, so TopShelf has its own kind of understanding of installing. Yeah, so you can still use this and it will work just the same because it's still an executable. And this might be easier if you need to do different things depending on the environment rather than relying on TopShelf changes. Or you just create a deploy.ps1, just like we did for the database that just calls your app with the install parameter.
So you can use a TopShelf and then use SC to install it?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. The nice thing that we do that like TopShelf I don't believe does is, or even using install util, you know with a service you install it, and then if you make a change to it, normally you stop the service and start it again. You can't really reinstall the same service because it already exists with TopShelf or just using install util. What we do is when we deploy your app, we always deploy it to a new folder rather than overriding the existing files. That's the default anyway, you can change it. So that means you've got an easy rollback point because the file's already on disk, you can just point it to the old application or the old website. But if the service exists, we'll find the service and we'll point it to the new path and then we'll stop it and we'll start it. So you don't have to script any of that anymore. Okay, so for this website, because I've got multiple web servers, I can configure what we call a rolling deployment. So I'll go here. So I mentioned that we run all the steps in parallel. Let's imagine we've got 10 web servers. I don't want to take them all offline, update them, and bring them all back. I want to do it one by one. So when you do a rolling deployment, you can configure a batch size. So that's how many machines we'll deploy to in parallel at once. So if I've got 2 servers, I would do one at a time. If I've got 10 servers, I might do the first 5 and then the next 5. So I'll leave that at 1. And I'll save that. And now we've got a rolling deployment. The other thing I can do is I can add child steps to this. And I'm going to add a PowerShell script. And I'll just call this wait. And it will just do a start, sleep. If you do that, I kind of always assume that these were milliseconds. They're not. You end up waiting a very long time because they're seconds. So we'll just make that 10 seconds. And we'll save this. And again, you can filter that by which environment it runs in. So what we have now is a rolling deployment that does 2 different things. So we'll go to one web server, we'll deploy the site, and we'll run this PowerShell script. And when both of those things finish, then we'll go to the next server and we'll do the next thing. So I'll click, so that's all done. I'm going to create a new release. Because I mentioned all those deployment instructions, we create a snapshot of them when you create releases. So if you make changes to your process or your environment variables, you've got to create a new release to go with it. So we'll call this 1.6, we'll hit save, and we'll deploy this release. We'll skip acceptance, and we'll go straight to production, because that's just how we roll. We introduced another feature called guided failures, which with a build server, you start compiling some stuff, you start running unit tests, and it either passes or it fails, and you kind of cancel everything you're doing. With deployment, it doesn't really work that way. You deploy something, and if it goes wrong, you just keep trying and trying to make it work until it eventually succeeds. Deployments don't fail, they might just take a long time and a lot of manual intervention to pass. So we have that mode in Octopus, which you can enable, and it's a really good idea for production deployments. Imagine we're deploying to 10 web servers. We're doing a rolling deployment. We do 1, 2, 3, they're all fine. We do 4, and some file is locked. So what a guided failure will do is it'll raise this error. The person watching the console can go in and unlock the file, remote to the machine, do whatever they need to do, and then they can either retry the step, so we'll keep going, or they can choose to fail it, or they can skip that server and just go to the next one. Okay, but hopefully this one won't fail. It probably would be good though, actually, if it did, because I could show it off. Okay. So that's running. If I need to save these logs, I can go over here to the raw output. I can download it as a text file to open it. We have a very hierarchical log because we're doing so many different things in parallel as we're running. Okay, here we can see we're deploying the website. We've started deploying the site, and if I go over here quickly and I try to refresh this and this, so this one you can see is loading. If I'm refreshing here, it's still just got the IS default website coming up. But when our sleep finishes, so we're still deploying the website at the moment, running our IS changes. Okay, so now that should have done. And we can refresh that. And that's our rolling deployment. So one machine was updated, then we went on to the next one. Otherwise, as I say, they would have been done in parallel. So is that cool? All right. So that's all good. So we've set up a process where TeamCity is building some packages, and we've got Octopus deploying them all the way, in each of our environments, doing the different configuration changes that need to be done. But we don't have much continuity between the two. What would be really nice is if I make a change and in source control, and it does a build in TeamCity, and if that's successful, I want to deploy that to my test environment. Probably not straight to production straight away, but at least to a test environment. So what I'll do in TeamCity is I'll go to my project and up here, and I'm going to add a new build configuration. So TeamCity projects have multiple build configurations. We'll give this one a name called deploy to test. We'll leave these settings for now. I'll come back to them in a minute. We're not going to use a source control server for this step because we're going to rely on some previous steps. And in fact, I'm just going to do some dummy data here so I can save this. So what we're going to do is I've got one TeamCity project, and I'm going to set up a dependency on this one so that when this one finishes, this one will start, and any artifacts that we're producing can be passed into this one. So I'll go to the settings for it, and I'll go to dependencies, and I'll add a snapshot dependency on this build configuration. And we'll also add an artifact dependency so that we can take a copy of the artifacts that were produced. Okay, we'll do this, and we choose build from the same chain. All of the artifacts we'll take all of them, and we'll put them, this is TeamCity syntax, that will just take any of the artifacts that were produced and put them in a folder called packages, which we'll clean out when we deploy. So it'll do that before it starts this build. I'll then go to build triggers and set up a trigger so that when a build successfully finishes for my build and test build, then we'll run this, and only when it's successful. Okay, so back here on general settings, instead of having another auto-incrementing build number from TeamCity, we'll set up a dependency. So we've got our dependency, we'll tell it to use the same build number that was used in the first build. So that way, each of the builds will have the same number in TeamCity. Okay, we can save that. Okay. And I'll delete this step. And we're going to add because we have this Octopus plugin installed, we can tell Octopus Deploy to create a release and optionally deploy it to an environment. So I need a few things to link it to my Octopus server. I'll need the URL, which is just localhost Octopus. That's something you choose when you install the Octopus server. I need an API key, which I can get from my profile page. Okay. I need the name of my project. So we're going to tell Octopus for the OctoFX project, deploy it to a specific environment. So OctoFX. My release number, again, I'm just going to use the build number. So whatever number, if it's 1.0.1, that value is going to flow through the system, and I'll end up creating a release in Octopus called 1.0.1. And we'll tell it deploy to the test environment. And I could add multiple here. I won't do production. I'll just do test. And we can have TeamCity Wait. So what TeamCity will do is, as it is waiting for Octopus to finish the deployment, it'll keep checking the status, and if it fails, the TeamCity build will fail, so you'll get TeamCity showing up red as well. So we'll do that. Okay, and if we now, I'm just going to change the build number here so I don't get a conflict. Just bump this up. And we'll kick it off. So TeamCity does its build, it's 1.1.10. This is going to take a few minutes to run from start to end if anyone has any questions.
When you were configuring the service, it looked like it was at the package level. You had the option there to select custom credentials to install the service to rise. Is there any management around multiple different user accounts for different environments?
Yes, so when you do, when you set the custom account name, this is a variable that, like most of our variables, can be bound to another variable that you've defined. So I can go in here and I can say use a value called my user. And then when I do that, over here on variables, I just add something called my user, and I'll give it a value A, and then my user, assuming I got the casing right, with a value of B, and then just give them different scope options. So one will be for one environment, just like I did for these ones.
So for dealing with passwords, are all those variables encrypted?
So the way you would encrypt, if this was the actual password, you just tick the box to mark it as sensitive. So that one is marked as sensitive, and we'll never tell you what that value is. It's stored encrypted in our database, and we'll try and strip it from any logs that it would appear in.
When I'm deploying websites to multiple servers, I like to put the app offline, send it there first so it releases resources and puts up a little maintenance page while it's deploying.
Yep.
Is there any way to achieve that?
Yep. You could do it, so there's a hook. When you create your application with your package in it, you can add in a number of PowerShell scripts. So one is called pre-deploy, which runs at the start of that package deployment, deploy, which runs somewhere in the middle, and post-deploy, which runs at the end. So you could use that to create your app offline file and then remove it at the end. Or you could use a PowerShell script step that, like the one we did for sleeping, and you could use that and have it run on all of your servers, then do your website deployment on all the servers, and then another PowerShell script that takes it off. Yeah.
You just flicked over into TeamCity and changed your build number manually. You incremented up to 10 because you created a 1.7.5 in Octopus.
That's right.
Is there a way to work around that if you don't need to create manual releases in Octopus, which is usually to pick up updated variables?
Yep.
At least, my opinion.
Sorry, I'll repeat the question. Yep, so I changed the build number here because I already had a build called 1.1.6 and 1.1.5. So if I'd run if TeamCity had done its build, I would have got a conflicting release being created. Instead of just always creating new releases, you can go in, you can delete the old release if there was a problem with it, or if you want to keep it, these releases they support semver versioning, so you can just call this, bad 01 or something. And update the release notes to say this was bad, don't deploy it again. And that frees up that release number, so then you can obviously use it again. So as you can see here, I've now got release 1.110, which was created by TeamCity. If I go to my dashboard, 1.110 was successfully deployed to my test environment from TeamCity. So, so what we'll do now is I'll create another build project, and I'll say promote to production. So this is a continuous delivery demo. Every time someone checks code into source control, we'll push it all the way through to production. Obviously, you may not want to do that, but again, we're going to have some, actually, I'm just going to copy, say deploy to production. My dependencies for this one, or the trigger for this actually, is going to be to wait for my deploy to test to finish. I'll update the snapshot dependencies to depend on that deploy to test build. Okay. So we've got that. So this is another build configuration, deploy to production. It'll wait for the deploy to test to finish. And the difference is, instead of creating a release, we use another part of our TeamCity plugin, which is just to promote a release. So again, we need our Octopus Server. Hopefully I've got my API key, which is there. So put that there. Then I'll take this. Again, it's the OctoFX project. I'm going to take the same build number. So take the build that was successfully deployed to test and put it into production, if everything's okay, and again, wait for it to finish when it's deployed. So I should be able to, I can't change the order of those. I thought you could. All right, so we'll let that run. I'll get 1.11. Any questions while we wait for that to run? Yep.
How do you roll back?
You don't. So, yeah, we get this question a lot. The way I think about it is, if I was doing a production deployment and it went wrong, and the tool then thought it was smart enough to fix whatever went wrong, because if something went wrong, obviously I wasn't expecting it, so I probably haven't told the tool, what to do when that thing goes wrong. If the tool then starts uninstalling things, doing stuff like that, it's probably just going to get in the way. So instead, when things go wrong, we try and give you the most information in terms of log information, that kind of stuff. We give you that ability to retry or skip, but otherwise we kind of assume that a human's going to get involved, they're going to fix whatever went wrong, and you're either going to fix a bug in your code or whatever and then deploy a new version, so you're rolling forward, or you're going to redeploy the old release over the top. But for applications like a website, it's pretty easy. You just kind of point IIS. But if you've deployed a bunch of SQL changes, then you've got to kind of undo all of those schema changes. But if someone has been signing up and they've created a $10,000 order, and because something went wrong in your deployment, you've now rolled it back, you see there's a lot of intricacies to the problem. So we give a few hooks. There's a PowerShell script you can run if your package deployment goes wrong to then try and undo things. But otherwise, yeah, we assume a human will get involved. Yeah?
Just regarding that human getting involved, if that deployment process is taking a fair while,
Yep.
and you don't know when it's failed, unless you come back in an hour or whatever, what form of system is there for notifications?
So we can set up, to find out why they didn't work, when you add a process, or when you're adding your steps to your process, you can send an email and throw in any information you need here, and then you can tell it to only run if part of the deployment process failed. So this is something went wrong, notify somebody. And potentially you could put a PowerShell script here that does something automated as well if something goes wrong during the deployment. Quite often the deployment is successful, but what you've deployed is bad. So when you talk about rollback, you're sort of talking about doing another successful deployment of something that didn't have a bug in it.
You're saying your software is more reliable than everyone else's?
Of course. Of course. Because I deploy it with Octopus Deploy. That hasn't run because there was no artifact dependencies. Okay, so which is fine because I don't need that. So I'll take that out. Okay, and we'll run that. Any more questions while that runs? Yep.
Do you have extensibility on those steps like send an email or change configuration settings? Because some of the, I deploy my packages in particular areas that have a lot of configuration files on them.
Yeah. So you're asking, is there, when I'm in here, for example, and I go to configure features, is there a way of extending that? At the moment, so you can write your deploy PS1 scripts and put them in your application, and Octopus will invoke them and pass variables in. We've done a big overhaul of the way Octopus is built in 2.0. So the whole website, the whole web application that you're looking at is just an Angular application that's we build in WebStorm, and it's completely separate from the Octopus Server, which is just a REST API. The stuff that does IIS websites and PowerShell and Windows services is just a PowerShell script that lives on the server side and some Angular UI to present that. There's very little in the way making those two features now. We don't have a way to easily go and build a plugin, but that's where we want to go with this. So for you to be able to define, here's my HTML to collect some variables, and here's my PowerShell script that runs on the server, but we can't do it just yet. So deploy.ps1 is the only way now. Yep. Yep.
With your environments and promoting, is there a way to say that you can only promote from, say, test, dev to test, and then test to production?
So you can't, yeah, so like in this case where I would deploy straight to production without deploying to my acceptance environment, a way to release that? At the moment, no. So what we've tried to do is concentrate on building a tool that makes a lot of the technical parts of deployment easy. And then obviously there are some human parts, like someone accidentally deploying to production, that obviously we could build some features around, but we're kind of hoping that there'll be, you have other ways to manage people on your team. Hire Damien, he'll come and shout at people for doing the wrong thing, and they won't deploy to production ever again. So, yeah. So it's something we do want to do, and have some controls about how you can deploy, but it's not a feature we've built currently. Yep. Yes. So in 1.0, we had a very strong, or I'll say very powerful permission system, but has anyone tried configuring the 1.0? Yeah, it worked like firewall rules. So you could say this person can do this and this one can't, and it ran from top to bottom. It was very powerful, but even I couldn't configure it most of the time. So we rewrote it, or Nick rewrote it for 2. So the idea is you have a bunch of users and you create a team, you give the team a name, you give them a role, so they might be a project deployer, so that gives them permission to deploy, and you can scope it, so they can only deploy this project, and they can only deploy it to test, for example. And then you add that, and then you choose who's going to be part of that team. So I'm the only user, I'm in that team, and that gives me the permission. And then by default, no one can do anything, and then you give them permissions to be able to do things. Okay. I think my time's up. That deployment worked from TeamCity. If I go to my dashboard, you can see that's all gone through. So any other questions about Octopus or TeamCity or automated deployment in general, I'll be outside, but thanks for coming.